Morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Kate Charters, and I'm the chair of SEGRA, which is the acronym for Sustainable Economic Growth for Regional Australia. SEGRA is delighted to welcome you to the 14th of our conversations about COVID-19 and regional Australia. I'd like to particularly welcome our two speakers for today. I'd like to warmly welcome Steve Torso, the Principal of Wholesale Investors, and Genevieve, Mortimer, Strategist with Climate-KIC. We're pleased to have been fully subscribed today, and so it won't be possible to have people talk during the session, but we do have a chat box which we'll keep an eye on during the panel discussion. You can record their questions for the panelists, or comments that you'd like shared, or resources that you'd like to make available to other people. And we'll be checking the chat box on the throughout the conversation. The other thing is that the recording of this event will be available on the SEGRA website tomorrow afternoon. You'll also notice at the top of the chat, we've got a link to the resources that we've put together and to one of the diagrams that we've been using as a summary of our conversations. As the COVID-19 pandemic plays out across the world and Australia acts to address the evolving situation, SEGRA wanted to provide a forum where people who live, work and invest in regional Australia could advance the issues impacting on regional, rural and remote Australia. The idea of this series of conversations is to assist bringing together key issues and opportunities while hearing firsthand from people tackling the impacts of COVID-19 in regional Australia. These impacts will be across health, the economy, education, business, lifestyle and well-being, to name a few. This week, we'll be looking at the investment attraction market and how it can provide opportunities as a pathway out of the current COVID-19 economic contraction. Robert has been collating our discussions and key issues over the last 7 weeks. Can I ask you, Robert, to show your diagram now and talk us through that, please?
Yep, no worries, Kate. We'll give an update of where we're at. As you said, when this all started, this was, we thought we'd, I suppose, have a conversation of try to understand what a post-pandemic regional Australia would be like, because we knew we were coming out the other end of this quite transformative process. But I think the other part of what we'll be trying to do is not only talking about it, but saying, well, what might be the best ideas to help build that regional bridge, the transition for our regional communities into a post-pandemic regional Australia. And part of our sessions have been about that, and we've been progressively collecting that information. And this diagram is some of the high points of the conversations. We've built it really from right to left amongst the sessions, because we're now up to number 14. And I'll just take the group to probably where we've just added in from last week's, because last week we had the circular economy discussion. And a couple of key summaries came out of that, in the sense of developing clean waste streams is a huge opportunity, and the whole circular economy idea is one that has a whole lot of depth to it, that clearly is part of the solution in a post-pandemic Australia. Very much this notion of embracing values over cost. There's a growing conversation about just in time for the cheapest outcome is risky. Is there more about, do we want to value more local sustainability, even though we might need to pay a bit more? There's an interesting conversation emerging around that. And I think the other thing that's interesting, conversations now, you might notice early on we talked about supply chains. I think in the very first session, people were saying, oh, we've got to risk assess our supply chains. And now conversations are happening everywhere. We're actually saying we need to actively shorten our supply chains. And I think the word supply chain now is becoming more localized. And I think we're going to be talking about that word at a placemaking level, even a lot more about local value, local supply chain. The other thing, a lot of conversation now about the process being a design thinking process, and a systems thinking process will be needed. And the other thing that's come up about collaboration, we've mentioned that a few times. There's been collaborative leadership, and other things have come up early on. But now people are beginning to identify that there are platforms where we need to join the collaborators. This notion that probably what's missing is not so much the interest in the stakeholder groups, but how do we work more effectively together in that information and discussion around creating platforms. And in some ways, that could be a little bit of a segue into some of the things we're talking today with Genevieve and Steve. But back to you, Kate.
Thanks very much, Robert. And now if I could just turn to Genevieve. Welcome very much to this conversation, Genevieve. I'd like you to perhaps start by telling us a little bit about what Climate-KIC is and what Climate-KIC does. So if you could kick off with something about that, that'd be great.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks, Robert, for that introduction, that outline of how rich the conversations have got. And so I'm very grateful to be joining in and poking in a few ideas at this stage. So Climate-KIC, my employer, I'll start by saying a bit about who they are. So the KIC, the KIC at the end stands for Knowledge Innovation Community. We're a not-for-profit independent organisation focused on supporting Australia through a transition to a climate-resilient zero-emission society. Now, that focus on enabling a transition, particularly in a lot of my work, is a key term for us, and one that I'm sure will come up, different things will come up in today's conversation. So for a bit of background, we're the sister organisation of a much larger organisation which is European Climate-KIC, or Climate-KIC EIT. And certainly the reason I was really interested in working for Climate-KIC Australia is when I lived over in Europe, I did some work with Climate-KIC over there, and I saw firsthand the innovative approach that they had to solving problems, and I wanted to be part of it. So I was very lucky that a year and a half ago, when I decided to move back home, I was then put in touch with the newly established Climate-KIC Australia. So I work for Climate-KIC Australia, but we have direct access to that global network of innovative people and tools that are coming through. As for us, our partners include state government, including Queensland governments and universities, and industry partners, including Suncorp and NAB. And our key theory of change is that we believe that people need to see things in action before they believe it's possible. And so, yes, we're sort of a bit of a bridge between a lot of theory that's coming out of academia, but our orientation is around that. We want our projects orientated around outcomes that are in the real world. Now, I just wanted to say a few perhaps leading framing for some of the early thinking we've been doing at Climate-KIC and reactions and insights to this conversation about post-COVID investment questions. So clearly, COVID has laid bare the complexity, interconnectedness, and the vulnerabilities that exist in modern civilization. And at a macro level, we can see that the fact that this is having such profound and devastating impacts on our economy perhaps demonstrates that our economies aren't wired to cope with some of the gravest challenges of the 21st century. Now, you could make the link, and we're sort of forming where those links exist in Climate-KIC, between this huge shock to the system and how we might need to increasingly react to other shocks to the system, or we already are, but perhaps increasingly to, increasing weather events, major biodiversity loss events, breadbasket failures at a global level, and all those shocks. There's some fundamental aspects of resilience in a resilient society, and I think some of those things that Robert talked to there about localization, regionalizations are coming up in relation to some of those concepts as well. From the finance industry's perspective, I hope, and what I do get a sense is happening, is that a greater willingness now to discuss what that resilient economy could look like. Why? Because we just can't escape that conversation anymore. So sorts of questions, obviously, that'll be coming up, or that are coming up, is what are the assets, what are the type of assets that we should be investing in if we're going to create this society, more resilient society? What are the organizations, what are the groups that should take part in creating those pathways? And what are the instruments and mechanisms to make these investments possible, and how do we measure? So how do we measure if it's progressing and it's successful? So excited to be joining part of this conversation, and certainly recognise that, you know, we're working from an incredibly strong foundation here in the regions and outback of Australia. And that sort of frontier mentality is linked in with entrepreneurial and problem solving attitude of Australian narrative. And I think it's also important to realise that that is perhaps that resilience that brings to a country is perhaps more important today than it ever has been in a post-COVID world. So thanks for that. That gives you a bit of a broad overview of KIC and how we're starting to think through some of these issues.
Thank you very much, Genevieve. I might turn to Steve now. If Steve, you could give us a bit of an overview about wholesale investors and the work that you do there, and then perhaps how it might work for regional, rural and remote Australia.
Sure, Kate. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for allowing us to participate. Look, to give you a context, Wholesale Investor at its core, we matchmake growth companies with high net worth investors, and we've built a database of high net worth investors, mostly across Australia, Asia, and also the UK. We've typically, the way we see ourselves is an online to offline model where we generate interest online and then we bring it to offline activities. In terms of the regional, it's interesting, just before this took place, we actually did a tour through regional Victoria. And to give, I think to help this fundraising discussion, to give it context, one of the things that we really found in doing these sessions and doing these workshops in going through regional Victoria was that regional towns feel almost disconnected from the city in terms of the fundraising exercise. And it really felt like there was, and it's almost in some ways that the investment people were almost put on a pedestal in some regards, which I thought was really interesting because that's not really how they would typically approach it. But I think what's beautiful, and obviously I come from the solution side, right? So we basically had to transform our business model to take everything online and create a virtual experience for how we showcase and how we profile opportunities to high net worths. And I think for regional areas, like this is such a unique opportunity for you to actually capture and basically attract interest that may have been difficult before. Given that people are at homes, given that people can't travel, given that, that effectively you now have the same potential for voice as what every other company does. It's just how do regional cities and how do companies in those regional cities create the visibility for themselves so that they can actually start to bring more attention and more awareness. There is some incredibly good stuff being done out of regional towns, and it's like, how do you get that awareness and that visibility into the normal or the investment groups that are interested in this? And I'll just finish with one story. There's a kid called Yangama who was building, I can't remember which city it was, but it was in one of the Victorian towns, and he was building an application that was being used by doctors in Africa. And this application was being used by 3,500 doctors because they have an issue with, they don't have quite the bandwidth that we would have. So he's built this app that makes it easy for doctors to get the latest information, education about illnesses so that they can treat their patients. And you sit there and you think, here's this young kid from a regional town working with a university that's building an app that can actually have an impact on millions of people. And you think, how does he get his visibility? How does he get his awareness? And how this environment levels the playing field. It's just about how do you create that distribution network to get that sort of interest. So that's the sort of how we're approaching it. And I think it's also to understand that investors in this environment typically like to become more aligned with the opportunities that they invest into, in that they want to be able to add value via their skills, their network, their connections, or potential strategic and trade partners that they can introduce a company to.
Thanks very much, Steve. I'm just wondering, when you're saying it's a level playing field, what sorts of information do people need to bring to the table?
So at a high level, I think if companies, and obviously we deal mostly with early stage companies, right? So we're talking about growth companies, we're talking about companies that are starting to expand, starting to get some momentum. Typically what they need to bring to the table is really a pitch deck. And that there's quite, you know, and we can sort of supply this to you as far as what that should look like. But there's an effective structure where you're solving, okay, here's an overview of the company, here's the problem, here's the solution, here's how we're approaching it, here's why we're the best team going forward for doing this, and here's the business model for that. You know, it's not that, it's actually easier than what people expect, but the challenge is I think it's just that disconnectedness, and it's like, how do you create the platforms to make people feel like they are connected and feel like it's normal for people to be communicating directly with investors?
And in your company, how would people approach your company?
Typically the way they just either register on our website, or people typically just add me on LinkedIn and then just reach out to me on LinkedIn, or they typically get referred to us via different networks. I will highlight that investors are, like, we brought 3 companies to Sydney as part of that. We brought them to our emergence conference that we host. From what I understand, 2 out of 3 of those companies have already either had significant interest that's led to investment, or it's in process of potential investment already. And I think what the message to communicate is, if you're working with companies that have got any sort of traction whatsoever, the investor brain thinks, if I can just help this company get more visibility or introduce them to this group, then that acceleration of growth has a strong possibility to take place.
And so can you give us your website address?
Yeah, it's just wholesaleinvestor.com.au.
Great, thanks very much. Genevieve, I'll bring you back into the conversation at this stage. Can you tell us a little bit about how you attract organisations that might be eligible for funding or investment raising?
So one of the main projects I've been working on in the last year is called the Adaptation Finance Project. And basically that's looking at climate change adaptation investment gap. So the adaptation investment gap is that we know there's a huge need, and actually a growing list of projects defined by many local regions to make us more resilient. But the amount of money flowing in from private investors is in no way matching that need. So in terms of attracting people to this project, which was originally kind of set out to say, okay, well, what are the new investment vehicles that might channel money into climate change resilience? That isn't difficult to get financiers interested. They want to be part. There's plenty of money there. So over the year, what I realized was the actual challenge is from our perspective for this specific project, and we've also seen it in other areas of sustainable transitions more generally, is actually, where are that great list of investable projects ready, like that are investment ready? And so attracting the finance is not actually the greatest challenge. The greatest challenge is to building out a large pipeline of investment ready projects to actually create this transition. So I think it's interesting, that idea of that connectedness and needing to actually create platforms to connect good projects with investors. But we're also finding with certain types of projects, including resilience building projects, where the business models aren't as clear, there actually needs to be some work in actually shaping new forms of value so that the business models are more robust and investment ready.
Can I just add to that, Genevieve? I've got a really good example of what you were just saying. Like, we've got a client that's doing fantastic revenue. They've got blue chip customers. They're raising about 20 million, and we took them to Asia, and they had really strong interest from Asian investment groups. And one of the investors that I introduced them to is actually a friend of mine. And basically I asked, how did he go with that company? And his actual reply was, they're the most disorganized company he's ever had a conversation with, and that the founders weren't aggressive enough. And so what I sort of learned is exactly as you said, there's absolutely money available for great projects. The challenge is, I don't think founders have ever been educated on what the actual process of raising money is, how to actually work with investors, how to work with financiers, what they expect, what is the process that they actually expect to work with. And a good example of that is a company that most people would probably know is Booktopia. right? Booktopia is Australia's leading online retailer of books. And this company struggled to raise money for at least 3 years. And then he brought on basically a guy to assist him with the actual process. They made one introduction. They changed everything so it was in the language that communicates with what investors would expect. And the company goes and raises 20 million, right? Mm. And so that gap, there's this big gap between, we do have great projects, but there's no one that's got any motivation to actually educate people on how to, firstly, where to get investors from, firstly, then secondly, the process to actually take them through. And then thirdly, help them understand what an investor expects in return, because Australia has incredible innovators everywhere across the country, but no one's educating those. And an innovator is a special type of personality, and to be honest, should often never deal with inventors, right? Except for explaining their product and talking about R&D. But there's that gap of what an investor expects to hear from a company versus what the company actually communicates to them.
Yes, I'm wondering if I could follow on a point there that Genevieve raised about these new financial values, because I know, particularly in regional Australia, we're at that spectrum. There's potential of freestanding investable projects. So there's a lot of it that's sort of impact investment, social enterprise investment, that value that moves to the other end of the spectrum. And Genevieve, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about some of the challenges that actually poses to existing financial institutions and that new value zone you're talking about.
Yeah, and we sort of talk about that. It's really interesting what you're both saying. So Steve's saying there's like a lack of, there's that knowledge in building up investment ready projects to be and connect them to investors. And we also see in a lot of areas, it is that unrecognized value that is stopping that business model. So it's not, there's a skills element, but there's also the fact that perhaps other initiatives need to happen simultaneously to see that value. Or there's the classic kind of environmental externalities argument where certain environmental values have been relegated to non-financial assets, but we actually realize with things like, resilience and other things, that's critical for the value of that asset or that project or even a innovation to succeed is interdependent with a lot of other assets or societal values. And typically business models, so if we're looking at a bit of a broader level than just sort of entrepreneurial aspects and startups, often investors look at that single asset and they judge a risk and return based on just that single asset. But there's an opportunity potentially to broaden that view and understand that value is created by multiple assets happening simultaneously. So if you think about a transition to electric vehicles, if you were going to do that transition to electric vehicles, the value of an electric vehicle company is dependent on having battery innovation in that region. Potentially it's dependent on distributed networks of electricity, it's dependent on skills and certain other behavioral changes. All those things factor in for independent value of single assets. And so we're interested in exploring that interconnected value and how that's captured and what structures that actually then create that as well. And so at Climate-KIC, this is sort of done through, we're exploring it through two main areas. One is called deep demonstrations, which is sort of layered interventions to shape new value. And then the other one is transformational capital, which looks at actually from the capital side, how you actually change some of the logic to realize and to see and to incorporate that value in models.
Steve, on that point, and I know for the key people you work with, you said high growth, high net worth, and that's a particular niche. Do you see any emergence in some of your investor networks that there is some interest in social enterprise or collaborative investment that's, you know, moved away from the high returns, but might be more about resilient community building and partnership?
We actually did with emergence, we actually did a session on impact investment. In fact, some of Australia's biggest family offices have moved into the impact investment area. The question is what the hard thing from my side is the definition of impact investment is becoming very, very grey on the types of, like when you've got typical life science companies trying to position themselves as impact investment opportunities, that becomes a little bit sort of grey. But absolutely, there is more money going into impact and obviously just anything that's sort of ESG connected.
So just following on from that, then with your work, I know often you tell stories that in communicating to investors, that investors are often looking at pretty simple human characteristics in the project.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could just unpack that a bit, because you seem to demystify the process.
So there's two different, basically the easiest way to describe it is a founder has an emotional journey with a capital raising, or the project leader has an emotional journey. And also the investor has their own journey. So what we sort of try help companies or projects understand is there's a psychological journey for investors. And it starts off with loss, right? The fear of loss. Now, when people think, yeah, that's obvious, they're worried about losing money. But there's actually 4 levels to those layers of loss. The first one is obviously money. The second one is time. When an investor invests into a project, there's a significant amount of time that they will invest into that, from maintenance, updating, you know, trying to bring other investors, their own auditing, you know, except especially if it's a large group. The third one is just credibility, right? If there's an issue with that, project they've invested into, they've gone and told their networks about it. They've probably attached their name to it visually on LinkedIn or something like that. So there's a credibility issue with it as well. And then the last one, which most people don't think about, is the opportunity cost. So if someone's investing 5 million into a project, they could have been investing that 5 million to any other project. There's a significant amount of competition for that capital. So they're the first tiers. Then the other part that projects need to be aware of is that no investor wants to be the first one in. So typically when someone's pitching a project, a company will say to them, an investor will say, who else has invested into the project? And if they don't have an answer for that, it's difficult. So the rule of thumb is no one wants to be the first one in, but also no one wants to miss out. So the key then is how does the sort of SEGRA ecosystem build up sort of key lead investors? Because it's always easier to find follow-on investors than lead investors. The lead investors typically do all the due diligence, they do all the sort of upfront work, and then people sort of typically follow that money. Now, it could be community leaders, it could be sector-specific leaders, etc. The next one is the sort of the bandwagon effect. So once a project starts to get some investors on, and you would see it in news when you hear it related to capital raisings, is that once one VC goes in, there's typically 3, 4, 5 other venture groups that actually go into it. This also happens with high net worths, and this also happens with family offices, and this also happens with institutions, right? They back other people doing, effectively, you know, humans by nature can be a bit lazy. So they back someone else's work that they've done on that project, and they will follow in on that money, knowing that they've also got themselves on the line. The last part is the fear of missing out, the FOMO. So once a project gets to a certain stage where they've got 70 to 80% completion of funding, then it's worried. And if it's got that effect where there's other sort of recognized names involved with the project, then they're worried about typically missing out on the opportunity. So, you know, they're the sort of fundamental, the psychological factors. The other ones we sort of highlight is that that short-term uplift is something that investors will often look for. So if there's a significant milestone coming up 12 to 24 months from now, they'll be looking to invest into that because it can provide them with potentially a 25 to 50% uplift. And then the other one is which is, I think, unique to our area. I don't think it relates to sort of the larger size projects that you're sort of talking about, but Genevieve, but it's that they want sort of, they're looking for a 5 to 10x return, right? So that's more when investors are going into an early stage company. It's like they're thinking, what is the path for this business generating me a 5x to 10x times return? So I hope that sort of...
That's great, because...
And that's without a presentation deck, Robert.
I know, you're doing well. This is a good follow-on, for I've got a question for Jen to segue into this, because Jen, you're talking about the target being demonstration projects. Steve's just said getting that first lead institutional investors, the breakthrough. How are you going with trying to do that on demonstration projects, getting those first interested investors?
Yeah, so on larger scale projects, probably that is where concessional, grants, layered, blended capital comes in order to take on some of the risk, and then you have your traditional financiers come in at the end. And so that blended approach on these larger scale sort of transitional project is going to be important, and we'll probably see in a post-COVID world, I think, more blended like PPPs. The actual governance is also going to change. Like we'll have to potentially innovate around that for certain types of projects. But yeah, I thought it was very interesting. Steve does a good pitch there with the key lead investors, bandwagon effect, FOMO, and then short-term uplift. And then it's like, what's that structure around that, which then ramps that up in regions as well. Like what gets the key? What's the value proposition for the key lead investors to take on that more risk? And
actually, to add to that, Genevieve, the two things we always talk about with people is firstly the visibility. How do you create visibility and this will sound weird on this, but how do you manufacture serendipity? So sometimes in the deal making process, people have this feeling like, oh, I was at the right place at the right time to discover this opportunity. But there's a lot of hard work in manufacturing serendipity. And then the other part is how do you create momentum in an offer? Right? No different to anything. Momentum is absolutely everything. And then how do you manufacture a time pressure? Because investors will take as long as time as you give them. So if you can't manufacture time pressure to get it done, or if there is no manufactured time pressure, then the deal can just drag on and on and on and on. So they're the real skill in that deal making is that, as I said, that visibility, then momentum, and then that manufacturing of that sort of time pressure.
That's really interesting, because I also think that at that level, you can also zoom out, and part of the things that we're doing is also trying to manufacture serendipity between projects as well.
Yes.
To maximize then the value of those individual projects that are ready to go. So, and again, that doesn't just happen. There is actually a manufacturing, like that process of doing it, I think is really an important part.
Steve, with platforms, and I know you've got the CRISP platform that I found really intriguing, because I think you've only launched it last year, but
correct.
It seems like it could be adapted into some of these regional pitches in a way, because I know it's specific to your niche, but could you just unpack the attributes of that? Because it's a good example, I think, of a platform providing a leverage solution.
Platforms have to provide the answer, because effectively what you don't want to let distance impact with the creation of opportunity, right? And look, CRISP is, whether it be a property project, a small company, it actually doesn't matter. We've got clients on there from Singapore, UK, Belgium, Australia, basically around the world. We've got different companies on there. So it's more that the reason for the platform approach is that if you can create a way that standardizes the way in which capital is raised, or standardizes the way in which companies introduce themselves, then that's helping the company, first step. And then the next step to that, to leverage off the platform, is then how do you create that additional visibility that we're sort of talking about? So CRISP for me is, obviously, mate, it's effectively 2 to 3 years in the making. We did launch it in June last year. There is nothing more beautiful than when you see someone go from start to finish completely online. And then also, more so from the project perspective, or from the company's perspective, we set up this thing called a frequently asked question management tool, right? So whenever you're raising money for a project, you basically end up answering the exact same questions over and over and over all day long. So we set up this tool so that people can actually insert their frequently asked questions, and then every time someone clicks on it, it gets recognized and it becomes a data point. So the questions which get clicked on the most move to the top. What that does for me is that gives me visibility over what's most important about my opportunity to investors. And also when I go into conversations with investors, I know what's most important to them based on the documents they've looked at and the questions that they've looked at as well. So the idea is that for projects or for companies, they want to have more intelligence in understanding what investors are interested in their projects so that they can also, and that the crazy thing that happens with that, Robert, is it actually helps with the structuring of your business model as well. It has an overlay into that. So, you know, to me, I think platforms are everything for regional cities, and also education is everything as well, because if you can just help either project owners or companies take their confidence from here to here in actually their own ability to raise money, you can change the game, because then all of a sudden they're not feeling like they're disassociated, or they're not feeling like distance is an issue. They make it actually their opportunity.
And is the platform still being used quite a lot, even in COVID at this time? Are you still seeing a lot of?
Yeah, and that's been driven by me. Like it's, you know, it's not like I'm sitting at home going, oh, well, I want, like we've run 2 virtual showcases in that time. One had, I think it was like 1,300 views. The other one had like 800 views. We've run a business summit talking about how companies can access capital, how they can save money, mental health, which is obviously super important right now. And that resilience aspect that you were talking about. And then also the HR component, which is important. This on Friday, we're running a venture investment summit, which we're just getting 20 investors to go back to back to back across all the different sectors to talk about what they're investing in, how they're doing it, how they've changed their approach, what their investment thesis is now, how they're supporting their investee companies that are having problems and challenges at the moment, etc. Because what's nice about our ecosystem, it is the most optimistic ecosystem you'll ever come across, right? There's businesses that are pivoting like that. You've got investors that are getting straight in and supporting. Like for me, I've got my shareholders delivering me, anytime the government release something, I get a report from one of my shareholders with it broken down in simple English as far as what that actually means to me as a company. That's valuable for me when I'm working 12, 18 hours a day to pivot our business. You know, so that's the sort of stuff that I think is really, really important.
Jen, in the context of regional Australian and demonstration projects, I just wonder, what do you think's the right team structure here? You know, we've got government out there obviously playing a leadership role, but it's got limits. How would we put this coalition together, or what structures?
Good question. Who is in it? I mean, I think, and some of the work I'm actually trying to do at the moment is doing a little bit of a skin in the game assessment. And then on top of that, the value proposition, you know, to know the right, I think there's two things, 2 ingredients to a good, like setting up a project for success like this. there's who are the if there's an organization at the local, state and federal level, and not organization but even people, so within the organizations that are kind of aligned on an intent, and then the concepts underneath that, the logic you're using. So some of these concepts around strategic synergies, or manufacturing the strategy around doing it, or, you know, aiming to localize supply chain, so that goal. Then I think that's really important, and I think government will play a huge role to whatever that backbone organization is. But there's also other people that might be aligned on that. So certainly that aligned objectives, and then looking at who's got skin in the game and who's where the value proposition is. So certainly the finance sector are interested. It'd be interesting to see how the industry super funds, what their next sort of orientation is in this rebuild phase. So if we just look at COVID right now, we had this sort of purge situation. Then we have currently we have a contain situation where, you know, we're trying to contain it. Then we move into maybe a reflect. If we're lucky, we reflect and actually spend a bit of time understanding, not just jumping quickly, but then there's going to be a rebuild phase. And it's, you know, even people who are aligned on that process, who wants to be part of the rebuild, there'll be a lot, and it's about then identifying in those governance structures for projects like circular economy and ones we've talked about before, Robert, and other more, you know, strategic assets. I think there is something, and then that you know, that systemic view of how we achieve them, there is something about finding the people that are aligned on logic, on the core concepts.
I wonder both of your opinions on that sort of post-COVID 12 months time when there's no government money left and we've got intergenerational debt or whatever they're saying, and we'll still need to fund projects, particularly in regional communities. We'll still need to be finding ways to invest in transition, but we may well be in an environment where there's even less government resources. So is that going to manufacture some new alliances with investors? And of course, when we're talking, we probably won't be 10xing too early on these sort of investments. But your thoughts on that, because it's going to be a different sort of financial landscape for regional Australia, probably 12, 24 months down the track.
So I think the data to give, you know, we launched literally the week of the GFC, right? So 2008. So this environment's not new for us. But I think the thing to highlight from a private investment perspective is it's been highlighted and documented pretty well that in the US, what they found was that at the moment, there's still capital available. You'll be still seeing deals getting done. There's still investments being made. Where it becomes a real big challenge is 12 months from now. So in fact, a lot of the investment groups are saying to their companies, if you have 12 to 18 months runway of cash, start raising money right now, right? Because you've got to get that funding in as soon as possible. The other thing to highlight is that this is the largest this ecosystem has ever been. This is the most visible the innovation sector for Australia has ever been throughout Australia. So what that means is there's more companies in the ecosystem, right? Also more investors, but also more companies. So you are going to see a lot more companies going to raise capital shortly. Now, I think from my perspective, 12 to 18 months from now is when it's going to be most interesting for companies, that's when predicted will be the lowest amount of funding going into companies. I think Australian companies have to stop thinking just about Australia. They have to actually focus on trying to get how we can get capital, not just in Australia, but also international capital as well. And if I look at my registry, I've got shareholders from 6 different countries on my share registry. So I know that without international investment, we don't exist, right? The platform that we've built doesn't exist. The momentum we've been able to create doesn't exist. So it's that, how do you access local capital and then at the same time build up momentum to start looking to try and get access to international capital as well? And highlighting what Genevieve says is that aligned international capital, where there's actually projects that can benefit from the innovation or, you know, from the projects locally.
Yeah, and what we're seeing at Climate-KIC, so Climate-KIC also run large innovation programs in the climate space, and in Europe they've done it for a decade now, and very successful companies individually. But what they're also now seeing is to actually maximize the value of that entire innovation ecosystem, you need to think a bit more strategically. And what can be done, and then Australia's could be the same. What do you do to actually make innovation ecosystems that are very high value, that then attract, that are then attracted, that create new markets in Australia, attract new skills and new ideas, and then regionalize sort of certain types of competitive advantages so that we even get more of that? Because that innovation ecosystem gets, as Steve's saying, capital's available. Now, the problem with a lot of certain projects in sort of these larger scale projects in regions is they are orientated towards accepting grants, and the capital means someone pays back, right? So you're in search, the government, this in a post-COVID world, every intervention that the government takes, probably because it's cash strapped, is in search of leverage. It's in search of catalytic value. Okay. And so that then means, well, what's the strategic way that you actually then encourage more of these companies that Steve's is suggesting, or encourage different types of ways that you can actually reshape new markets by not, that's beyond a grant giving logic. And yeah, with deep demonstrations, that is connecting different parties together and understanding that when they work together, that then you catalyze more value.
Just quickly on that grant giving logic, I find this really interesting because we've only just applied for our first grants in the last 2 years. That's the Export Market Development Grant, right? And now the R&D grant. Now, the really good thing about those is you can actually leverage off those to raise capital from private investors. I think what's the best thing that government can do, or even sort of the people on this listening, is that effectively what you can do is open a door this much. If you can open a door, whether it be via platforms, networks, introductions, or anything like that, it is really the job of the founders and the project leaders to take care of the rest. I'm not a believer in that, government should be doing everything. All I believe is that government should just create that sort of platform, or make that sort of, how can I say it, that segue easier, so that if you open that door this much, I will work day and night to make sure that I get my project or my business off the ground, and I make sure it's as successful as possible. The challenge with being grant related is it means you're putting the success of your business reliant on someone else. And that is the biggest fundamental flaw that can happen in the psychology of any founder or any project leader. Yes, it can play a role, but if you're just naturally conditioned to basically building a business model and a business case that is open, that private investment will look to invest into, the rest of the money should follow as well. And I think that's the attitude that can be altered and changed when you discover that, holy shit, actually private investors do want to invest into, into regional projects, regional companies, etc. It's just the business case has to be, to laid out. And I don't believe that government should be the ones just doing that. All I think is governments just open that door slightly. That's like what Monash did for us, right? Where they took us around, they introduced us to I went around in regional Victoria, met those 3 companies, incredibly happy because they had the door open that wide for them, that they got to get some new introductions, new contacts. It's then over to the founder to do the rest. It's over to them to break their back, doing everything possible to build their business, not the government, or not industry bodies.
I'm going to have to interrupt this conversation. It's been extremely interesting and very, very valuable. So thank you both, Genevieve and Steve, for that. We're completely out of time. We've got just one comment here, which I'll make, which is look at inefficient and potential local assets and systems and organisations and use them as platforms, for instance, waste authorities and active farmer organisations. So thank you, Andrew, for that suggestion. But if I could just bring it to a close now and thank both Genevieve and Steve for their time. Now, Steve, do you quickly want to give your web address again, please?
Sure, it's just wholesaleinvestor.com.au. And if, I'm pretty proactive on LinkedIn, so it's just Steve Torso. Feel free to add me on LinkedIn.
Thanks. And Genevieve, your best email address or website?
Yeah, I can, I'm happy to share my email address maybe in the chat, or genevieve.mortimer@climatekic.com.au. So feel free to get into it. And our website is Climate-KIC Australia, I think should get you there, .org.au. But yeah, get in touch. If anything.
KIC.
KIC, yeah.
Yes.
Been absolutely fabulous. Thank you for your participation. We will distribute a communique that captures the ideas in today's conversation and the remarks in the chat box. We also have a latest news section on the SEGRA website where the general button will take you through to some useful websites. If you'd like to contact me directly, my email is kate@segra.com.au. and Robert's email is robert@vitalplaces.com.au. On Friday, we'll be hearing about practical priorities and actions for recovery. Coming from Toowoomba, we'll be hearing from the Chamber of Commerce and a tourism perspective about some of the practical responses to COVID. Our speakers are Todd Rawle, the CEO of Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and Peter Honan from Southern Queensland Country Tourism. So I look forward to joining you again on Friday.